Thank you so much, choir. Thank you, Alabama Baptist, for the privilege of these past 2 years. I want to invite you to take your Bibles and find Deuteronomy chapter 8 this morning. And while you're turning there, I owe a debt of gratitude to so many who've supported me and encouraged me and prayed for me these last 2 years. I could not have done this without my wonderful wife, Tammy, our amazing Etowah Baptist Association staff who are here today. They have held the fort down the many days that I have been away. The churches and the pastors of Etowah Baptist Association have been wonderful in their support and encouragement. My pastor, Matt Alexander, in the First Baptist Church of Gadsden, and the choir of First Baptist have provided the music before my message each year. Dr. Lance and the State Board of Missions, missionaries and staff, each of our entity leaders, campus ministers, Drs. Beck Taylor and Charles Smith have been prayer partners and supporters in the best possible way. And I want to express my sincere thanks to them all. But let me say that the last 2 years have not been without their toll. I have a picture of what I looked like when I was first elected 2 years ago. And here we are today. So all I can say to the next president is to beware. You may age 50 years and you may lose your hair. It's been a great journey. And today I want to bring you a message entitled Compelled to Remember. Compelled to Remember. How soon we forget is more than a proverb. It is a reality of life. The fact is that we all suffer from many kinds of amnesia. We forget names and places and dates and appointments and even the names of old friends, but fortunately, most of what we forget is not all that serious. The problem is that most of our memories, especially with regard to the great matters of the soul, are like a sieve, which lets the fine flour through, but catches and keeps the chaff. We tend to hold fast to those things which we would be better off to forget and forget what we would be better off to remember. So because of this tendency of forgetfulness in the spiritual realm, it is more serious. Because of the things that we do forget. Moses addressed this problem. He does it more than once in the book of Deuteronomy, but particularly here in Deuteronomy chapter 8, he addresses this issue of forgetting God. And in it, he tells us and warns us of the dangers that we face when we do this. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11, we don't have time to do every verse in this chapter. But in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11, it says, "Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments." Deuteronomy 8:14, "Then you will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God." Verse 19, "It shall come about if you ever forget the Lord your God." Thankfully, Moses gives us principles that will help us avoid this pitfall. He has given all of these principles before, but because of the proclivity of God's people and us to forget, he repeats them several times in Deuteronomy. What is the compelling remedy for our spiritual forgetfulness? Well, there are three things that I think Moses tells us in this prolific chapter. The first thing he tells us is that we are compelled to obey. We're compelled to obey. That's the charge that he gives us there in verse 1, to be careful to obey. And maybe the charge that is most often given in the book of Deuteronomy. But in verse 1 it says, all the commandments that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do. The Hebrew word there is the word shamar. Be careful to do that you may live and multiply and go and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. Obedience and blessing go hand in hand. The Hebrew word for shamar is used 65 times in Deuteronomy. The best way to translate it is to pay careful attention to. We cannot expect God's blessing if we live in disobedience. We can't expect God to bless us if we're walking in disobedience. Then he gives the charge again in verse 6. He says, therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and fear him. Here, Moses gives us what we might call the heart attitude needed for obedience. The heart attitude for being obedient is the fear of God. We ought to have an attitude of fearing God. But the practical outworking of that attitude is walking in his ways. If I have a proper fear of God and a respect for God, then I'm going to have a great desire to obey him, to walk in obedience with him. I don't want it to be any other way. This is what I want. This is the way God wants us to walk with him. Then he comes again in verse 11 and gives us the charge again. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. If we do not obey God, we forget him. If we do not obey God, we forget him. Because that's just the way that it works. We may preach in God's name. We may go from meeting to meeting. We may even attend the Alabama Baptist State Convention seeking a blessing. And we may be consistent in presenting our prayer requests for God's help in our lives. But if we are not obedient to God, that is the same thing as forgetting God. This is what Moses is getting at. This is Moses' concern, is that the children of God are going to enter this promised land, and their hands are going to be full of gifts and things that they've never had before. And he's concerned that they're going to get distracted. And in their distraction, they're going to forget God. If we're going to live a faithful life, if we're going to live by faith in the Lord with gratitude for his goodness, we must make a determined, heartfelt effort to keep his commandments. We cannot trust our natural powers of recollection. We may remember things naturally, but our flesh being what it is, we will not remember the truly important things of God unless we set out to do so. This is what Moses' challenge is. We are compelled to obey. Why are we compelled to obey? Because we have a healthy fear of God, and in that healthy fear of God, our desire is to walk in utter obedience to him. Because why? Because we don't want to forget him. We don't want to forget God and all he has done for us. Second thing he tells us is that we are compelled to be humble. We're compelled to be humble. Moses uses words like humbling and testing, hunger and provision to help them to see their utter dependence on God. This is what God does to the Israelites and to us. He brings us to the end of ourselves so that we would acknowledge our helplessness. Then we can look at him and avail ourselves to his help. Now Moses uses illustrations of when they were needy. When they were hungry, there was manna. When they were thirsty, there was water from the rock. But God also teaches us in times when there are plenty. I love what G. Campbell Morgan, the old preacher, said in his comments on this verse. He said, note carefully that they were not to learn from hunger only, but also through bread. This is very important. We are sometimes prone to think that God only speaks to us through limitation and suffering, but it is not so. He speaks to us through prosperity and through joy. In the day of adversity, he certainly speaks, and we generally listen, but he also intends to teach us in the day of abounding gladness. Let us listen then also. We usually have no problem when the needs are great and the resources are weak with listening to God. But what happens when our hands are full? What happens when we actually have strength? What happens when we actually have resources? Do we listen to God then too? I think G. Campbell Morgan has a valid point. That we don't just listen to God when there's need. We listen to God when there's bounty. And I think sometimes we forget that. God was teaching his people that true life is found in more than full stomachs and material things. They had to learn that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. The reason this is so important is because a result of forgetting God is that it can lead to an arrogant self-sufficiency. It can lead to an arrogant confession. Listen to what Moses says if this is left unchecked. Moses says in verse 14, he says, "Then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Listen to what he said in verse 17. "Otherwise you may say in your heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth." Notice that you say this to yourself, or you say this in your heart. The implication is that we still go through the motions of worshiping God and thanking him in public, but to ourselves, we offer congratulations. I studied while others were playing. I worked while others were sleeping. I was shrewd while others were making mistakes. And on the self-praise goes. And outwardly, we may go through the motions of praising God, but inwardly, we congratulate ourselves. It was our energy and our ability that did it. God fades and disappears, and instead of singing "How great thou art," we sing "How great I am." Moses says that's unacceptable. When you get in the land of plenty, it cannot become about you. It's got to stay about God. Obey his statutes, obey his commandments, and that will be where we need to rest. God has taken care of his people, and he does the same for us. He reminds the people that, now listen to this, 40 years in the wilderness, he reminds them, he says, your clothing did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. My feet are swelling right now. The experience of being in need not only teaches us to depend upon God, it also opens the door for God's marvelous provision. How many of us have been through times of frustration and asked God, why is this happening? Only to realize later that God had done things through that time that were way above anything we had dreamed. Moses is reminding them, I know. You can just hear the empathy in his voice. I know those 40 years were tough. I know they were challenging, but the wilderness wandering is about to pay off. God is about to keep his promise. The promised land is there before them, and great riches that they've never known before. But Moses pleads with them. Don't forget your God. Don't forget how I've taken care of you. The third thing he teaches us is that we are compelled to overcome our forgetfulness by recalling that all we have is God's gracious gift. In verse 14, Moses describes how people living in the lap of luxury take credit for their prosperity. And in such situations, it's easy to forget our tough situations before God intervened and helped us. So Moses reminds them of the deliverance God gave them. Listen to what he says. You will forget the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of flint. In the wilderness he fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do good for you in the end. Now, would you not think, if you were a child of Israel, would you not think that those memories would be indelibly imprinted in your mind? He did bring us through the wilderness. He did rescue us from fiery serpents and scorpions. He did give us bread. He did provide for us water. How dare they forget what God has done? And yet Moses has to say these verses, but yet are we not, if we are not careful, are we not inclined to the same thing? How many of you remember being set free from the bondage of sin when Jesus came into your heart? How many of you recall that? How many of you remember when life was tough and you were lost and in the chains of sin and Jesus Christ came and set you free? How many of us remember spiritual wildernesses and God gave us a word from his word and lifted us up? How many of us have experienced times of spiritual thirst and the fountain of living water floods our soul and quenches that thirst? Do you remember? Do you recall? Or have you forgotten? Are we like the people of Israel? How do we overcome? How do we overcome our forgetfulness? It takes a deliberate effort at memory to begin our recovery. Our success in our churches and in our ministry depends upon God being true to who he is and his word. Listen to what he says in verse 18. But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant which he swore to your fathers as it is this day. And when we lose the sense of being under God and that God is sovereign over our lives, God will become our adversary. Listen to what he says in verse 19. It shall come about, if you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. How could this happen? I'll tell you how it happens. It's because we naturally focus on our own hard work and perceived brilliance. Yet it is God who gives the body and the brain and the talent. Moses understood that forgetting God might have many causes coming from several different means. The primary means would be pride. Full of pride, they would follow other gods and serve them. Full of pride, they could look at other nations being judged in front of them and think, we're better than them. He would never do that to us. We're safe. But God could, and he did. Proud self-reliance would lead Israel to destruction. And the same is true for us. Pride of face is obnoxious. Pride of race is vulgar. But the worst pride is the pride of grace. George Washington, in his farewell address, said 99% of failure comes from the people who make excuses. There are no excuses for forgetting God, because everything we are and have and accomplish is because of him. All the glory belongs to God. Erwin Lutzer, a longtime pastor at Moody Church in Chicago, said this. He said, when the time comes that you and I will no longer be seen, may it be said that we left a well-lit path behind us. Over the last couple of years, and a little longer than that, we have been able to raise awareness on some things that perhaps we've overlooked and perhaps we've overforgotten. As I close my message today, I want to ask you to work with me on this. And as my time as your president draws to a close, I want to ask you not to forget these things. And here they are. Number one, remember the local church is the headquarters of the Alabama Baptist Convention. The convention isn't merely an organization you join, it is an organism made up of churches. You are the convention. Pastors, leaders, lay people, churches together. We're the convention. Number two, remember the cooperative program is still the best way to fund missions and theological education. This year we marked the 100th anniversary of the cooperative program, and after a century, it is still the best vehicle to train up ministers and missionaries and to spread the gospel across our state and around the world. Nobody's come up with anything any better. Number three, remember that making our churches safe places for children and teenagers must remain a high priority. Hear me and hear me well. There is no excuse for any church not taking action to prevent abuse and predatory behavior inside their walls. No excuse, okay? It's time to stop making excuses. There's no reason for any church to not take some step to make their church a safe place. Number four, remember that we must continue to make calling out the called an intentionally consistent part of what we do. The pastoral shortage crisis is real and it's here. Presently, we have 500 Alabama churches who do not have pastors. 418 of those average 75 or less, and really, probably more accurately, probably run 50 or less. Yet, did you see the profound support of cooperative program in the 1 to 100 category a while ago that Jay showed us? Over $6 million. $6 million comes from churches that average 1 to 100 in attendance. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's only 2 million less than churches that run 1,000 or more. I mean, just let that be in perspective. But yet many of these churches don't have pastors. Does that not break your heart? I read a Wall Street Journal article not too long ago that said, and you can take the Wall Street Journal with a grain of salt, but the Wall Street Journal said that churches are beginning to look for ways to operate without a pastor. Wow. Now, if that doesn't scare you. So we need to be profoundly committed to calling out the called for our churches. Next, we must continue to let bivocational ministers know they are valuable and important and needed now more than ever. We must intentionally make sure people know that bivocational and part-time ministry is a real ministry calling. We must offer training opportunities for those who are called into bivocational ministry and make them aware of the many opportunities to serve the local church in this way. Pastors, I had a pastor tell me in a one-on-one conversation, I was sharing with him my burden for this area. And the pastor told me, he said, Craig, we have planted churches in many different places, but I've never thought about sending anybody across my county. Think about it. If you've got gifted, God called people in your church, call your director of missions and say, I've got somebody that's wanting to serve, and see if God doesn't send them across the county to serve the local church. Remember to pray. To emphasize the importance of prayer as a priority in your church and your community. If we want to see God move, we've got to cry out to him. Last year we had 11 prayer rallies around our state, and we must continually, collectively cry out to the Lord for him to move in our midst and to send a spirit of revival where we live. And the last one. Remember, as our choir prepares to sing one more time, we are going churches for a coming Christ. All right? Let me say it again. We are going churches for a coming Christ. And we pray that he comes soon. But until then, we're going to keep going. May God stir our hearts, and may we be compelled to remember today. Listen to this choir.